There's bad luck. There's stupidity. And then there's that deluxe category of human disaster where a guy somehow ends up in a full-blown criminal situation because he lacked the social instincts to realize that two men sprinting toward him from a white van were not there to discuss insurance options. Today's story comes from our TIFU, where Op managed to get accidentally kidnapped in such a humiliating way that it almost deserves a commemorative plaque. And the question practically asks itself, at what exact point did self-preservation leave the building and let embarrassment take the wheel? The next Reddit post came from a guy we'll call James. James was 31, worked as a financial analyst, and had the general energy of a man who still said you too when a waiter told him to enjoy his meal. He also had a nearly supernatural talent for wandering into absurd situations with the same calm expression people wear while comparing prices on printer paper. His younger brother, Jason, 28, was the exact opposite. Jason was handsome, reckless, charming, unemployed in spirit if not on paper, and protected by the family with the kind of blind devotion usually reserved for children and unstable zoo animals. According to James, everything started on a Thursday night, which already felt like the universe clearing its throat before saying something nasty. His car had gone into the shop that morning and his mother, Julie, called asking for a tiny favor in that exhausted saintly voice mothers use right before dragging their responsible child into some fresh nonsense. She wanted James to borrow Jason's pickup truck, drop off some paperwork to their dad, John, at the office, and swing by the pharmacy because Jason was, in her words, all tied up. Of course Jason was all tied up. Jason treated basic adulthood like it was an optional side quest. James said he didn't even want to drive the truck. First, because he hated owing Jason anything. Second, because the inside of the vehicle smelled like warm energy drinks, stale gum, and decisions that usually end in court-mandated anger management. Still, he agreed. Because obviously this story was never going to be called TIFU by setting healthy boundaries and surviving peacefully. After dropping off the paperwork, James stopped at a 24-hour pharmacy. It was close to midnight, the rain was thin and annoying, and the whole city had that bleak washed out look like it had made several mistakes and was trying not to talk about them. He came out carrying a plastic bag with reflux medicine for his dad, eye drops for his mom, and wet dog food for the family dog. Because apparently hell likes to add a humiliating detail whenever possible. Nobody wants to be kidnapped while holding lamb recipe pate for a spoiled beagle. As James crossed the parking lot, he saw a white van parked crooked behind Jason's truck. The side door slid open before he even had time to process the scene. Two men stepped out fast. One wore a black cap and a dark jacket. The other had patchy facial hair, the tired eyes of someone who had clearly been raised by bad decisions. The guy in the cap yelled, "Get in the van. Jason, don't make this stupid." And James, in a moment that deserves to be framed and studied by future generations as a warning, genuinely thought this might be some kind of idiot, praying from one of Jason's idiot friends. So he answered with possibly the most useless sentence ever spoken by a man about to be dragged into organized stupidity. "I think you've got the wrong guy." What a lovely sentence. So polite, so measured, so crisp. Shame he said it to two men who were clearly too busy executing a kidnapping to appreciate verbal nuance. The bearded guy snatched the pharmacy bag from James's hand, looked at the receipt with his name on it, and decided this was some kind of pathetic fake out. Before James could come up with anything smarter than "No, seriously, I'm not Jason," they pulled the black bag over his head, zip-tied his wrist, and shoved him into the van. He also banged his knee on the door frame on the way in, because apparently even during his own kidnapping he still couldn't make an entrance without looking mildly incompetent. Inside the van, James said the most unsettling part wasn't even the initial panic. It was the conversation. These men didn't sound like movie villains. They sounded like irritated debt collectors arguing outside a strip mall. One complained about traffic. The other kept asking where Jason had hidden the money. Every few minutes they repeated lines like "The boss is done playing around, he should have paid." When he had the chance, James tried again to explain that he was James, not Jason, and that he had only borrowed the truck. The man in the cap said Jason probably practiced that excuse already. The bearded one muttered that if he really was James, then he had the worst luck on earth. To be fair, at least one person in the van was being observant. James estimated they drove for about 40 minutes. At some point they left the pavement. Eventually the van stopped and they dragged him into a place that smelled like dust, damp wood, and old paint. When they took the bag off his head, he found himself inside a half-renovated house in the middle of nowhere, which is exactly the kind of place criminals use when they want the setting to look like. It was chosen by someone who watched too many low-budget crime shows and took notes. They tied James to a plastic chair, which somehow felt more insulting than frightening. There's just something deeply offensive about being interrogated in the same kind of chair. People use at backyard barbecues and cheap birthday parties. The guy in the cap paced back and forth, asking where the money was, where Jason had hidden a Rolex, why he hadn't paid back the gambling debt, and what happened to his mother's bracelet. That was when James realized something important. Jason wasn't just in debt. Jason had apparently been building a full collection of disasters. Like some people collect baseball cards. James kept insisting he knew nothing. He gave them his job title, pointed them to the office badge in his coat pocket, explained that he did not own expensive jewelry, and definitely had not stolen a bracelet from his own mother. The bearded man searched his wallet. He pulled out James's driver's license, a few cards, a grocery receipt, and a loyalty card for a health food store. He stared at the contents with a kind of spiritual contempt and said, "There is absolutely no chance Jason carries a Kefir rewards card." That, according to James, was the first crack in the kidnapping. The man in the cap grabbed the ID, compared the photo to James's face, and asked why he had Jason's truck. James explained everything, but the problem with plain truth is that it often sounds too boring to be believed. The man called someone and said they might have picked up the wrong brother. On the other end, the boss was apparently quiet for a few seconds before telling them to confirm it. That was when James's phone started ringing. The caller ID said Jason idiot, which James had set months earlier after some family argument. The universe, when it wants to mock you, always adds detail work. The bearded man answered on speaker. Jason launched straight into complaining without even asking for James first. He wanted to know why the truck had gone offline on the tracker, and why James wasn't answering his phone. The man in the cap asked with the kind of calm that feels more dangerous than yelling. Whether Jason really wanted to continue this conversation in that tone, there was silence. Then James heard his brother's breathing change, and the first useful sentence Jason managed to say was, "You grabbed James." Not "oh my god, is he okay?" Not "let him go." Not even a panicked shout. Just that. "You grabbed James." According to James, that was the exact moment the fear changed shape. Being kidnapped by strangers is one thing. Realizing, in the middle of it, that your brother recognized the situation a little too quickly is a whole different brand of horror. They hung up. The bearded man stared at James like he suddenly understood the script had gotten uglier. The guy in the cap spent the next 2 minutes cursing Jason for being a rat, a liar, and an idiot. Apparently Jason had described the truck, the neighborhood, and even the jacket, but forgot to mention that his brother occasionally borrowed the vehicle. Tiny oversight. Just enough to get another human being stuffed into a van. James stayed tied to that plastic chair for another 3 hours. They never beat him, but Fear did the job just fine. At one point they gave him water. At another, the bearded guy handed back the dog food and casually observed that it was too much meat for a beagle. James didn't even have a beagle. He had a pug mix. But somehow the criminal's confidence made it more disturbing, not less. Around 4 in the morning, the boss finally told them to let James go. The man in the cap cut the zip ties, warned him not to look back, and handed him a crumpled $20 bill for a cab or therapy. The bearded one muttered, "Sorry about the mix-up," with the same tone someone uses when they bump into you in a grocery aisle. They dumped James at a gas station off the highway. The cashier assumed he had been mugged. Technically, that was almost cute compared to what had actually happened. When James got back to his parents' house, he expected horror, concern, maybe some delayed panic. There was panic, yes, but the ugly kind. Julie cried. John paced. And the first useful question either of them asked was, "Did you call the police?" Not "Are you hurt?" Not "What did they do to you?" Not "Where's your brother?" No. Did you call the police? Because, as James found out over the next few hours, his parents already knew Jason owed money. They didn't know about the kidnapping, but they knew about the gambling, the loans, the sold watch, the pawn ring from an ex-girlfriend, and the ongoing family tradition of shoving rotten problems under the rug. Till the rug begged for a transfer. Julie begged James to wait until noon before talking to the police. She said Jason was not well. John called it a scare tactic, right? Because nothing says minor scare tactic like accidentally abducting the wrong son, zip-tying him to patio furniture, and dropping him at a gas station like damaged merchandise. James said he agreed to wait a few hours because he was exhausted, in shock, and still trapped in that old family reflex of believing maybe, somehow, the mess could still be handled privately. That one sentence alone explained exactly how many years he had spent being trained to swallow insanity in the name of family harmony. Jason, of course, never showed up. He didn't call, didn't text, nothing. Noon turned into 3 in the afternoon. James drove to the police station and filed a report. Reddit in the comments did what Reddit does best and attacked the situation with the tenderness of a flying brick. Plenty of people wanted to know how a grown man could get kidnapped that easily. James explained that he didn't exactly hop in willingly, though he admitted the first second of confusion lasted longer than it should have, because he genuinely thought it might be one of Jason's friends being stupid. Other commenters pointed out that the bigger issue wasn't the kidnapping itself. It was the fact that his parents were more worried about Jason than the son, who had just spent the night tied to a plastic chair in some criminal renovation project. For once, Reddit was painfully accurate. People also asked why James kept helping Jason at all. James explained that Jason had always been the difficult one in the family, which is family language for he causes all the destruction, everyone excuses it, and the most stable child gets turned into unpaid emotional staff. 2 days later, James posted an update. The police already knew Jason. That is never a promising sentence. They found records connected to gambling, illegal betting, fraud, and prior complaints involving threats. The detective also told James something that should be carved into stone and mailed to every parent. Who enables one child into full moral ruin? Jason had used James's name as collateral in at least one debt arrangement. He had apparently told people that if anything went wrong, his brother would handle it because he had money and hated public embarrassment. So James hadn't just been kidnapped by coincidence. He had been kidnapped because his brother saw him as a human backup plan. When Julie found out James had filed the report, she actually said he was ruining Jason's last chance to get his life together. There is something rotten at the core of a sentence like that. A man gets kidnapped because his brother used him as leverage, and the mother's first instinct is to protect the brother from consequences. It was almost impressive, in the same way mold can be impressive when it reaches the ceiling. Their older sister, Jenna, got involved and defended the parents. She told James he should have thought about the consequences. James replied that he had. And one of those consequences was maybe dying the next time someone decided to confirm his identity, after tightening the restraints a little too much. Finally, for once, someone in the family was speaking in complete sentences. More commenters flooded in. Some asked whether the kidnappers had physically hurt him. James said not beyond being shoved around and bruising his knee. But the worst part wasn't the handling. It was hearing Jason's voice on that call. Jason hadn't sounded horrified. He had sounded irritated, like a man discovering the wrong package had been delivered to the wrong address. The next update was worse. Because it always gets worse. The police found Jason for days later hiding in the apartment of a 43-year-old married woman who, according to James, insisted Jason was trying to turn his life around. Of course he was. Every useless man in freefall eventually finds an exhausted older woman with a rescue complex and mistakes her spare bedroom for redemption. When police arrested him, Jason actually tried to argue that James had exaggerated everything, that nobody had been kidnapped for real, and that it had just been an aggressive pickup for a conversation. What a phrase! An aggressive pickup for a conversation. That's one way to describe being bagged, zip-tied, hauled into a van, and interrogated in a half-finished house. By that logic, prison is just involuntary networking. But the ugliest detail came from the statement one of the kidnappers gave police. The bearded man admitted that Jason had sent messages weeks earlier saying that if he couldn't pay, his brother could be used for pressure because he was the only one in the family with a stable job and enough fear of scandal to pay quickly. He also said Jason had shared where James worked, what neighborhood he lived in, and the fact that he sometimes used Jason's truck. The original plan had been to grab Jason, but James, in the man's words, would work almost as well. Almost as well. According to James, that was the line that made him physically sick. Not the black bag. Not the chair. Not the van ride. That line, because it meant that in Jason's mind, James wasn't his brother. He was a substitute asset, a fallback, a usable body with a bank account. Once that came out, Julie and John turned from pathetic enablers into full-blown moral roadkill. John tried to claim Jason probably didn't understand what he was saying, sure, because writing down your brother's name, address, schedule, and financial usefulness for criminals is obviously the sort of thing people do by accident, like sneezing or misplacing car keys. Julie told James he shouldn't hold on to hate. She even suggested that after everything calmed down, he should go visit Jason in jail, right? Because after being used as collateral and accidentally kidnapped, what James clearly needed was quality sibling bonding time under fluorescent lighting. James said he laughed, not because it was funny. Because at some point, when your family becomes that grotesque, laughter is the last thing standing between you and hurling a dining chair through a window. Reddit was unusually united in the comments after that. Jason got called every name people reserve for siblings who belong in documentaries. A lot of commenters told James to cut off the entire family. Others said Julie and John were emotionally complicit in everything that happened. One user wrote that James had not been accidentally kidnapped. He had been bureaucratically sacrificed. Honestly, that was such a perfect description it should have been printed on the case file. 2 weeks later, James posted one final update. He had moved out, blocked most of the family, and filed for restraining protection connected to the case. He also learned that Jason had been using his name for months, not just with criminals, but with women, lenders, and anyone else gullible enough to believe he had a respectable brother willing to clean up the mess. In one recovered message, Jason described James as uptight, weak, and scared of embarrassment not to pay, a touching tribute. Really, but the grand finale somehow got even worse. Julie showed up at James's new apartment uninvited, crying at the door, and confessed that about a week before the kidnapping, Jason had told her he might need to use James's name in a conversation, and she hadn't asked what that meant, hadn't warned James, hadn't told John, hadn't done a thing. Because, according to her, she assumed it was just some small debt stuff. That phrase deserves its own spot in the Museum of Parental Failure. A son casually says he might need to use the other son's name in some shady debt issue, and the mother decides that's not worth follow-up. Then later she acts shocked when one son gets zip-tied and dumped at a gas station, while the other gets arrested. It's honestly stunning how some families can turn criminal negligence into a love language. James ended the story by saying the biggest TIFU wasn't getting accidentally kidnapped. It was spending his entire life believing that because he was the responsible child, he would also be the protected one. Instead, he found out the hard way that in his family, being the responsible one just meant being the easiest one to sacrifice, and honestly, the kidnapping was just the receipt if there were scores to hand out. James gets 0 out of 5 idiots for finally waking up, though he deserves a light slap from fate for tolerating this circus for so long. Jason gets a full 5 out of 5, plus an honorary trophy for being the kind of brother who would probably sell your kidneys, and then call to ask why you're being dramatic. Julie and John deserve a solid 4 out of 5 for raising a man who treated his own brother like a line of credit with a pulse. And the final question is pretty simple, because this mess stinks from every angle. Who was worse? The brother who handed over his own blood, or the parents who heard the warning signs and treated them like background noise?